the emissions problem that we have. And we've tried to put together quite a radical programme, and Alan's been absolutely key in all of this because he spent years and years studying all these different and complicated mechanisms like contracts for difference, and how do you incentivise and how do you make things happen, and what needs to be done actually to change and actually produce the change that we need if we're really going to meet the climate challenge targets. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Alan. He's going to speak for a short while, perhaps 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. For those of you who like the politics all mapped out for you, what we do in the opposition is we sort of reflect the positions that there are in government. So Alan's official sort of position is our shadow minister for energy. Yeah?
And climate
change. Great. Yeah, okay. Well, if I hand over to Alan now, and you okay sitting? Would you understand?
Yeah,
if you look back up here, please say, and make sure you can. All right?
Well, one of the reasons for standing is that as time goes by and you get longer and longer sighted, you can read your notes standing position down on the table, which you can't read close up, so I'll do that way. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm, as Ian said, I'm Alan Whitehead. I'm the Shadow Energy and Climate Change Minister for Labour, and I'm also a Member of Parliament for Southampton. I haven't come up from Southampton today. I've come over from London, where the latest non-exciting things are happening in Parliament. And I have to say, I am absolutely delighted to see everybody here this afternoon, because I must say I was sitting on the train thinking, I wonder how many people are going to be here this afternoon, and to see such a great turnout is I don't kid myself. That's because there's posters all over the town saying Alan Whitehead, Shadow Energy and Climate Change Minister, was about to turn up. But I think it's because of what I've already been hearing about in terms of your commitment in this area to some very practical work on renewable and low carbon energy, which is at the heart of the sort of thing that we're going to have to do over the next period. So I'd like to think that Kidwelly will be one of the beacons of that low carbon and green energy, which we're going to need in such abundance in the not too distant future, and run and organise on a community local basis for the future. And I've been already talking to several people who are involved with that locally, and I think that's just brilliant. And if you can get that going, despite all the impediments that there are at the moment, which we might talk about later on, then that will be a really great step forward. Now, as far as climate change is concerned, I've got a post, a big blurb of a cartoon on the wall of my office, which is a bloke at a lectern, apparently addressing an audience with a microphone in front of him, and there's a date on the lectern, and it says sort of 2000. He's saying, look, I think we've got a problem with climate change. And then there's a 2004, we've got a problem, and I think it's getting worse. And he goes 2010, same person, same lecturer with the microphone. The figures really are serious, and we're not making this up. And then it goes to about 2015. Look, we're running out of time, we've really got to do something. And we've got all the stuff here, the science. And then it goes to I think this is rather an old cartoon, goes to figure 2019 on the lectern, and then he's tapping the microphone saying, excuse me, I'm not sure the microphone's on. And what I had thought, I must admit until fairly recently, that was where we were with climate change. But I'm really encouraged by the enormous upswelling of action and school strikes and various other things have really brought attention to the emergency that we are under at the moment, and have started focusing that beam of action on the issue of climate change recently. But I'm very encouraged, but at the same time very concerned, in as much as that microphone has just been switched on again at the point when it's getting to be too late. And that actually, if we'd have done half the things that we think we're going to have to do now, say in the early 90s when Kyoto Conference first really got together a global program of action on climate change, then we actually have a fairly, I wouldn't say exactly smooth path, but a much less arduous path down to 2050. Whereas now we have a situation where, okay, Nia and I were in Parliament just recently for the declaration of a climate emergency in Parliament, which was done by our side in the chamber, and although the government side didn't actually oppose it, they were not conspicuous by their presence, I think, in the proceedings. So we now have a climate emergency declared in Parliament, and the other thing which I was particularly proud of, just recently, last Monday, literally, we had the occasion where a bit of an odd occasion where, in a 90-minute debate on a piece of secondary legislation in a three-quarters deserted chamber, we actually moved change in our targets on climate change from the 80% reduction in emissions by 2050 that it's been since the passing of the Climate Change Act, to a new 100% target, which effectively means net zero, which we'll perhaps come and talk about in a minute. But it is an absolutely, I think, fundamental and significant change in where we now go as far as climate change action is concerned. And it's well, we may say, as I will come to in a moment, we may say, well, that's all very well. You've changed a target which we weren't achieving previously to a new target which we may be even less likely to achieve, but at least we have now a clear position as far as the UK is concerned, which actually does address the science as far as climate change is concerned, and the role that the UK has to play in that global drive to bring emissions down and make sure that, as the science tells us now, that the global temperature rise should not, by the middle of this century, be more than about 1.5 degrees C. And that is an advance in science in terms of the fact that at the time of the passing of the Climate Change Act, which again, Nia and I were both around for that, being somewhat long in the tooth in parliamentary terms, I think. Nevertheless, that was Labour passed that through in 2008. We had a structure, which again I'll talk about in a moment, which did allow us to move forward, but on the basis of that idea that 2 degrees was the global limit of global warming, which the world could tolerate, if you like. Tolerate is not quite the right word, but that should be the way we should move forward as far as climate change was concerned. And we know now that the recent, among other things, the recent International Panel on Climate Change report, that actually there's all the difference in the world between 2 degrees warming and 1.5 degrees warming in terms of a whole range of things, on extinctions, on warming of sea levels and so on. I mean, it does actually, it doesn't sound like an enormous difference, but it does make an enormous difference in practice, and that therefore, in terms of our global targets, and this was reflected at the Paris COP, one of the meetings which goes on for the original International Climate Change Agreement, that certainly there should be a world aspiration for 1.5 degrees, and that the subsequent COPs from that have talked about indicative national contributions on the basis that those should all get together and should all add up to 1.5 degrees across the world. So the UK's contribution to that has to be a net zero economy by 2050 the latest, and I personally think that actually we need to be a little before that. I mean, the formulation I've been using is that we need to have 1.5 target, as it were, before 2050, and the earlier you can achieve it, the better. 2050 is what the Committee on Climate Change has come up with recently in terms of its report to Parliament, but certainly talking privately with the committee staff and so on, they're saying, well, the 2050 target is what we think we can achieve, but you can actually stretch that to get a little before. You certainly, I don't think the science, and you may want to discuss this later on, tells us that we're probably not going to be able to get to a position where you can get to that level, say by 2030, or even some Extinction Rebellion people say 2025. There are actually some brute facts which actually likely stop that happening, but that's the trajectory we should be on. So that's where we were and where we've come from currently, and what the UK's contribution then now has to be to that global effort to make sure that those temperature changes stay below that level. And that's the end of the good news, really, because what we know from those INDCs that have come in following the Paris COP, the indicative national contributions, that when those are all put on the table and added together, we've actually got a likely global rise of 2.4 to 2.7 degrees. So on an international basis, we're a long way from even having the plans in place to get to that level. And so a lot more work needs to be done. The COP 27 is coming to London in the next year, and that is going to be the occasion on which a number of those plans are going to be updated and put together on the table, and we hope that they'll come down considerably. But that's, as it were, the bad news on a global basis. Then it's also the bad news on the UK basis, because what is happening at the moment in terms of progress on getting emissions down is that, as far as the 2008 Climate Change Act is concerned, we have made what you might say is fairly good progress so far in getting emissions down, but there are particular reasons for that which actually don't stack up in terms of a smooth path for the future. It's not a linear process. There are all sorts of things like coal coming off the system and gas coming on the system, various other things which gave some gains in previous years, which you can't gain them twice. It's going to be really great that coal is going to be off the system entirely. I know I'm talking to a community historically substantially built on coal, but I've got to say it's not something that we can continue with as a method of gaining heat and power for the future, because of its carbon intensity, and actually the same goes in the medium term for gas as well over the next period. the progress that we have made is based on the, well, also arose from the Climate Change Act, and that is the 5-year carbon budgets that the Act very wisely put into place. So it wasn't just at the time in 2008 an act of Parliament which said, wouldn't it be nice to get down to 2 degrees, 80% reduction by 2050 from a 1990 base. It set in place 5-year budgets which the government was supposed to adhere to. The Committee on Climate Change would recommend the budgets. Those budgets will be on a constantly contracting carbon budget base, and that would mean, in theory, that the carbon emissions that we were counting for each carbon budget would progressively come down, because obviously it doesn't, I think, take much thought to realise that you could, in theory, have a situation where all the emissions go constantly along a period, and then suddenly you close everything down in 2048 and you allegedly got to your goal, but actually all the carbon that you haven't taken progressively out of the air is still out there, so you haven't achieved your goal. So it's got to be a constant and progressive reduction of carbon over the period. And that's how it's worked so far, that there have been carbon budgets, the first 2 carbon budgets, 5-year budgets from 2008 point of view, 2013, finishing in 2000, second one finishing in 2017, the third one coming up for finishing in the next couple of years. And the Committee on Climate Change is required to put carbon budgets out 2 budgets ahead for government consideration. And so we have now, we already know what is in the 4th and 5th carbon budget, what we've got to do to meet those particular carbon budgets. And I have to say, in terms of what we do know about that, we are not doing very well at all. And if anything, the government is actually glossing over that by relying firstly on the fact that we actually exceeded the first 2 carbon budgets, and actually saying, well, we've exceeded the first 2 carbon budgets, so let's borrow and bank some of the extra success in reducing carbon that we've had in the first 2 carbon budgets in order to put on top of the 3rd and 4th and 5th carbon budgets. So that's all right, isn't it? And of course it isn't all right for the reasons that I've outlined. So we're in a difficult and dangerous situation, I think, in Parliament at the moment, of actually contemplating government claiming it's successful in those carbon budgets by, frankly, fiddling the figures as far as those budgets are concerned. And what we know for the 4th and 5th carbon budget is that from all the things that have been published, all the things that have been done, all the targets that have been set in all the different areas, and the Clean Growth Plan that's been published in Parliament just recently, we're likely to be off target in the 4th and 5th carbon budget by about 6%, 6% emissions above the budget for the 4th carbon budget, and 9% for the 5th carbon budget. And in recent figures, that's getting worse, the suggestion that we may well be even further up. Now that's just at the moment when, as I've said, last week we moved the target goalpost a bit. So that 4th and 5th carbon budget coming up between now and 2027 has itself got to be revised downwards to accommodate the new trajectory that we're going to have to put forward over the next period. And when the 6th carbon budget comes up, that's got to be even more stringent. So that's the not very good position that we're in at the moment. And so the question for us in the opposition is to say, what is it we would do in government to put that right, and what are the things that we've got to do over the next 25, 30 years, real things in the real economy to actually get us not only back on track, but on track for those much steeper emission reductions that we've got to undertake over the next 25 to 30 years. And it's significant that in terms of looking a little into where we've fallen short, where we haven't fallen short, and this is from recent Committee on Climate Change reports, emissions have substantially fallen in the power sector. That is, we have done pretty well in terms of electricity production over the period. We've now got something like 36% of power coming out from renewable sources. If you count nuclear as a low carbon fuel, then a little over 50% of power is coming from low carbon sources. And that's a very substantial advance over recent years. I have to say, again, in terms of claims on that, that was all the stuff that was put in place between about 2005 and 2010 in terms of the regime for offshore wind and things such as that, which has run through and has proved to be very successful. But nevertheless, we're quite a long way forward. But emissions from all other sectors, transport, industry, buildings, agriculture, waste, etc., have actually been flat since 2008. They haven't really reduced at all. And there's a limit to which the power sector itself can actually do all the heavy lifting as far as greenhouse gas emissions are concerned. And that's underlined, I think, by the mistake, I think, that a number of people make in talking about my particular brief in Parliament, which is they will say, oh, well, your brief's energy, isn't it, particularly? And I'll say, you're doing okay with energy. And I will say, no, we're not, because you have forgotten 80% of the energy, which actually, energy total, even if we exclude transport emissions, which goes on heat and cooking and domestic heat and industrial heat, i.e. the whole heat sector. And in that sector, we are doing just terribly. We are doing terribly, firstly, because in terms of what goes in to our houses, we're wasting most of it by going out through the roofs and through the walls. And secondly, we have virtually no penetration of low carbon heating arrangements in our housing stock. So only about 7% of housing is actually heated by low carbon means. So we have a target in Labour of 60% of energy being renewable and low carbon by 2030. And when you put that together, and we think about the enormous lag that we've got in terms of heat, then it's got to be virtually all energy being renewable as far as power is concerned by 2030, and perhaps 45 to 50% of heat in buildings also being low carbon by that date, in order to block off that particular area of our concerns to keep us on track as far as emissions are concerned. Now, the question then is, how do you do that? And that's where we've got to come to next. Now, as far as power is concerned, then to get to that position, we've clearly got to do a lot more, essentially of the same, in terms of getting us to those really low emissions at that point. Which means, probably in terms of offshore wind, for example, about 5 times the deployment of offshore wind that we've got at the moment. So we think we're doing okay, but we need a lot more. Doubling the amount of onshore wind that there is deployed at the moment. Now, you may say to yourself, hasn't the government banned onshore wind? which indeed it has effectively. You can't. Yeah, I was about to come to that. Yeah, I mean, as far as the whole of England is concerned, you cannot put up an onshore wind farm, not just because they've taken all the subsidies and underwriting away, but because the government has put through some pretty savage planning restrictions and various other things, which actually effectively mean that if you're an onshore wind developer, you would really need your head looking at if you went through all the processes to try and get an onshore wind farm up in England, because you would almost always fail. Not the case in Wales, not the case in Scotland, but again, both Wales and Scotland are still suffering from the fact that all support has been withdrawn, but it's not the same as far as planning constraints are concerned. But it is clearly not remotely on the cards to hope that somehow in people's wisdom in Scotland and Wales is going to see the day through in terms of onshore wind. We've just got to get onshore wind going seriously again in England and double that number of installations as far as England is concerned. As far as solar, probably a trebling of installations, and that's both field solar and solar on properties. And that means that a number of additions to that in terms of the developing arrangements for battery installation, and actually combining those solar installations with batteries which can store and change peaks in power, so you've got a much more reliable source of power from those solar installations. But essentially, getting those installations, getting those working together so that you've got, it's essentially cyber power stations by aggregation of solar roofs and solar field. And by the way, and I know this is one thing which I think a number of people have already come up against, it's got to be a situation where you can actually deliver your power directly to people's homes that you're producing, not just your own roof, in a way that actually enables communities to benefit from that power being produced as a whole. And that is also effectively, I wouldn't say exactly outlaw, but close to being outlaw presently in terms of the regulations that apply. So you've got to do a lot of work on that. As far as heat is concerned, then we've actually got to throw every mechanism that we can think of in terms of different courses in different parts of the country, but essentially a full-on attack on what is the predominant issue of heat, which is the continuation of gas in heat supplies. Now, that does not mean, as was received wisdom, I think a few years ago, that heat can be completely electrified. You just produce electric radiators for everybody's homes, or ground source, air source heat pumps, close the gas supply down, gas network down, rip people's boilers off their walls, drill a hole in their garden, and you're away. It doesn't mean that for a number of reasons. Firstly, because I think people will probably run down the garden trying to get their boilers back while they were being removed. But the improbability of thinking about the complete electrification of the heat system is twofold in its improbability. Firstly, probably because of the preponderance of heat in the overall energy firmament, as it were, if you transferred all that heat to electrical demand, the amount of electricity you would have to produce, and let's assume, by the way, we haven't got to that yet, we don't have electric vehicles over the next period, you would have to probably build something like 30 or so new nuclear power stations in order to cope with the capacity that you would need at that particular point. And secondly, the variation in demand on heat is of an order of 6 times different than the variation in electricity supply presently. That is, people switch their heat on and off at different times of the day, different times of year, and if you had to accommodate all that on an electrical basis, then that would give you extra power stations you'd have to build in order to cope with that variation. So how are we going to deal with that particular problem? Well, the way we're going to have to do it is a combination of bringing on some electrical changes. I was in Bridgend just a little while ago, and they're conducting a trial there of so-called hybrid heat pumps, whereby you keep the boiler system in your home. The heat pump does the business of providing background heat, an air source heat pump, when you need just that background amount. When you need heat peaks, then the boiler comes in. It's all joined together with some clever technology, particularly good for off-grid properties where they've been heating with oil and various other things. So you can bring in gas for the tanks, or indeed, ideally, biogas for the tanks in the boilers, and then you're using a lot less gas and heating the properties pretty well in the process. And I climbed up a particularly steep hillside to see a farmhouse which is kitted out with this. It's an experiment at the moment, but it does seem to work very well and saves energy costs very substantially in the process. But generally, there will be, I think, a combination of some hydrogen in the system, in hydrogen islands. So there's an experiment already going on in Leeds to see whether Leeds can, as a system in the city, cope with a hydrogen input. For some detailed reasons, I think that's not going to be possible to get going across the country, not least because the way of making hydrogen at the moment, I mean, hydrogen doesn't come out of the ground. You've got to make it, in principle, easy to make, because here it all is around us, in the water. But you've either got to electrolyse it, 2 things in the water, hydrogen and oxygen out, or you make it from gas, a process called steam methane reformation. And if you're making hydrogen from gas and you're putting it into people's homes in order to substitute for the gas, well, you're roughly back where you started from, unless you do something like carbon capture and storage on the gas in the first place to keep the carbon out of the air. So I think what we're going to have to do over the next period is, number one, inject into the gas system biogases, which can be made from anaerobic digestion, various other things such as that, low carbon gas, biomethane, so that substitutes for the gas in the system, some hydrogen areas, some electrification, some district heating schemes in large cities and towns, but a systematic policy of getting those different horses for courses in to those towns and cities and various places across the country, coupled with, and here's another big one I think we've got to get going on the not too distant future, coupled with a systematic programme of bringing that efficiency of our homes up to a reasonably good level in order to keep the stuff in the properties once it goes in there. And now we've got actually some of the worst insulated homes in the whole of Europe. Not only that, we've got some 8 million homes around the country which haven't actually got any cavity walls at all. They're single-skinned properties. And not to put too fine a point in it, we've just got to insulate all those across the country. And that's not just the sort of schemes we've seen at the moment where an occasional vulnerable person is found and an energy company goes and whacks up the insulation. These need to be blanket area-based insulation schemes which bodily lift the energy rating of those properties. And bear in mind that the government has just said, well, we're going to make sure that new properties haven't got gas going into them after 2025, and we're going to do things on energy ratings in new properties. Same government, by the way, that actually cancelled Labour's zero carbons home policy almost as soon as they got into power. So again, if that zero carbons home policy for the new build had still been in place, we'd have been so much further down the road in terms of not having to treat those properties again, but we've actually got a situation where we are still building new homes on SAP rating D and E, which means that in a few years' time you're going to have to go around to those new homes and treat them. And it's just an absolute scandal in terms of the way we're facing in the wrong direction as far as our building is concerned. But nevertheless, 80% of the homes that we've got now are still going to be there in 2050. So the concentration absolutely has to be on retrofitting those properties that we've got at the moment. And that's going to be a huge programme run, I should think, mainly by local authorities. Those are people who have long memories will know about things like housing improvement areas and the general improvement areas. Well, I can see in every town, every city, there will be energy improvement areas where we'll be tackling those worst properties first and getting that systematic energy insulation going. And that has several wins, because one of the things that will happen as a result of that is that we will simply not be talking about fuel poverty in the same way that we are in the future. And actually, if you go to some other European countries, they're a bit mystified about us talking about fuel poverty. 2.5 million people in serious fuel poverty as a result of the concentration of low income and poorly insulated properties, a great correlation between those. Because they have developed their housing stock in such a way that although the price of energy may be higher, the amount of energy that you're using is much lower, so you don't use that proportion of your income on energy costs. But this is one particular way to drive out fuel poverty from the country as a whole. And in addition to that, if that works well, something like 25 to 30% less energy, and particularly gas, will be used in property. So an enormous change in terms of how much demand there is in the first place. I mentioned the other energy area, the transport. Now, there is no alternative right now that we have. I've said we're not probably going to electrify heat. We've just got to electrify transport, and we've got to do that. The government has said a very vague suggestion of 2040, and even within that suggestion that hybrid vehicles escape that ban. I'm afraid we have to, I'm not afraid, I'm rather pleased to say that we've got to do that probably by 2030 at the latest. That is, over the next 10 years, we've got to systematically replace internal combustion engines with electric vehicles. And that's sort of within 2 cycles of vehicle purchases. So it's a really tight programme. Interestingly, the tide is turning quite substantially about electric vehicles. The industry is beginning to respond in terms of availability of vehicles. The difficulty we've got right now is how we put the infrastructure in place to enable electric vehicles to operate in terms of journeys roughly as well as internal combustion engine vehicles do. Now, one of the good changes that's happened, anyone here got an electric vehicle already? Oh, that's brilliant, right. Okay, so you will know that you have taken that choice despite range anxiety. Leah, you've got a leak, haven't you?
And it's a real problem, and so have Dot and Gary at the back, but it is an issue and we are really campaigning hard to get more in rural areas. It's really challenging.
So I mean, we've got a present position that, again, the government are assuming that this is all going to be done by triple charging through your fan light or a charger on the outside of the house. Now, actually, if we get too much more people with electric vehicles in Acacia Avenue and turning up at home at 6:30 and putting their car on charge, that blows up the substation at the end of Acacia Avenue. So we've also got to put in place a system of firstly of strengthening. I don't think that's going to happen in terms of households, but getting a system whereby you can pretty reliably get a fast charge on your vehicle within about 20 minutes. And that's going to have to be done probably by putting large batteries in certainly motorway locations, but in a lot of other locations as well, so that you can guarantee that you've got that fast charge without blowing anything up, and you've got the battery, and there's a potential 15 megawatt battery going in near me in Southampton, which means that you can have the equivalent of a garage forecourt with charging vehicles. And the system at the moment, frankly, of even when you're not home charging and having an occasional charge point, which may not be very high power, also may not actually be available when you get there because someone has parked their SUV in front of it. I'm not attacking SUVs, particularly annoying. Or indeed it's not working. I mean, that is just not the way we're going to have to go, and we've got to, and that has to be publicly funded, a publicly funded, proper national infrastructure system to make it easy to convert your lifestyle to electric vehicles. Now, a good thing happening on that generally is that the latest models that are coming out have got a range of about 200, 250 miles, which is not bad, but we're still going to have that natural infrastructure difference. The next area I want to come to briefly is, I think, the real killer area, and that is agriculture and land use. And it is interesting that nobody, and I include the Labour Party in this, has really said any serious home truths about agriculture and land use as a part of reducing carbon emissions over the next period. That, along with aviation and shipping, are the areas where people have been remarkably quiet whilst actually being pretty loud about other areas. So, issue with agriculture. Firstly, we have a substantial dairy farming economy. Cows do their business. Emit a great deal of methane in the process. We also run our agriculture on very carbon intensive arrangements, large amounts of fertilisers, ammonia based, which itself is a very carbon intensive chemical to produce. And we've, by the way, over a much longer period, we've pretty much chopped down most of the trees that used to cover this country historically, and themselves operate as a very substantial carbon sink. So what we want to do from Labour in this particular area is to start with a radical afforestation policy for the whole of the UK. And that is, again, this is particularly informed by some of the things the Committee on Climate Change said. The target would be that we actually, at the moment, the UK as a whole and I'm going to come to Wales, Scotland and England here as well, the UK as a whole has got about 13% of forest cover. The European average across the whole rest of Europe is 44%. We as an island are some of the least forested parts of the world, and it's even worse in England than it is in Scotland and Wales. Wales about 15%, Scotland about 18–19%, England 10%. And not only is it worse in England, the amount of planting that's been taking place has almost ground to a halt. Government's got a proposal or plan, which it says, and figures sound really good, 11 million trees they want to plant. Now, when you do the sums on this, and by the way, those are the latest reports from the Forestry Commission on how that 11 million plan's going, is that it's going very badly. They're missing the targets by 70%, i.e. virtually none of that 11 million has got planted and is going to get planted. And if you do the sums, if you talk about that ideal of where we are with 13%, let us say we go to 19% across the UK as a whole. Interestingly, the Welsh Government and the Scottish Government have actually got much more substantial plans there for afforestation than is the case in England. But it still falls very substantially short of what we need. What we need over the next period is not 11 million trees, we need 2.4 billion trees over the next period. Now that means a substantial programme of getting hold of marginal land, either in terms of public ownership of that land, advanced compacts with farmers, duties, I imagine, on county councils, particularly in England, to establish certain parts of the land as afforestation targets, duties in planning commissions to have a certain part of those planning commissions afforested, and a very substantial government funding programme to make this all happen. It's not just a question of going out and planting those trees, it's a question of managing them subsequently. And I mean, some evidence, for example, some of the mitigation on the HS2 route at the moment, people have been planting trees, so tick, done the tree planting, and then they all die. So unless you manage what you're doing over a period of time, then you're not going to get to your targets. And managing that greatly enhanced afforestation land does also mean that you are, for example, thinning out your original tree planting. You're then providing the wherewithal for the final thing I want to say about this whole process, and the trees are part of it, that you will recall some while ago, and I'm sorry it is some while ago now, that I started by saying, well, the 100% target means quite different things from the 80% target in terms of we can't just get to low carbon, we've got to get in a number of areas to negative carbon, because there will be carbon overhanging in terms of a number of processes even after we've got carbon capture and storage to energy production, particularly in intensive energy production. There will still be quite a lot of embodied carbon still going out there. So you need negative carbon arrangements to offset that to get to your zero target, which you didn't under the 80% target. You could just get low carbon. And trees, frankly, are the best negative carbon device you can think of, because it so happens that the growing period of trees is the the highest part of the process whereby they sequester carbon. They then long-term sequester carbon, obviously, when they're mature, but the rate of sequestration is lower. But at that point, even if you take a trunk of a tree out and you put it into, say, different forms of building, you put it in timber frame building, for example, then you've sequestered that carbon from that mature tree for a very long time. There are other techniques of negative carbon, BECCS, which is biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. So if you're using those trimmings from those managed forests in order to produce energy without actually clear felling of the tree and burning them in their own right, and you're adding carbon capture and storage to that process, then you've got a very substantial negative carbon energy process on the way. And I've mentioned carbon capture and storage. That is clearly the absolute sine qua non of a lot of the process, because we cannot get to 2050 with our steel industry, our cement industry, our very aluminium, pottery, all those energy intensive industries, not having carbon capture and storage added to them in order to allow them both to keep going and to not make a carbon contribution which busts the targets in the process. So that's what we've got to do in that particular area, and that is essentially what Labour is now committed to. Everything I've said here, we are effectively already committed to in policy terms. And believe me, when you put them all together, that does add up to a real process of actually getting our carbon emissions down at the rate they're supposed to come down, and meeting those new carbon budgets and getting us to that 2050 target. Now, you will undoubtedly now, we're going to have, I think, at party conference this year, we're going to have some people say, well, okay, why can't it be 2030? Why can't it be 2025? And I think that is firstly, it's a misreading of what the International Panel on Climate Change has said. There's a suggestion that, some headlines probably, IPCC says we've got 12 years to save the world. The 12 years that the IPCC is talking about is not we have to be net zero within 12 years, but we have within 12 years to have got to a position where carbon emissions are not increasing anymore, and we have the things in place which will guarantee that those emissions go down very rapidly and at a sustained level to get us to that low carbon goal. And I had some discussions with one or two people about this, and there are some sort of things that you just can't do within that particular period. And I mentioned trees. Even if we planted all the trees that I've suggested tomorrow, they still wouldn't be capturing that carbon before 2030, because they wouldn't have grown very high by that point. And so if we're putting those things into place, they've got to capture the carbon solidly over a period of time, but you know if you're planting them and you're maintaining them, you know that trajectory is steeply down. Similarly, the only way we could get to 2030 in terms of heavy industry is by closing it down. And at that point, then we wouldn't actually have any steel or concrete to build the wind turbines that we've got to put up over the next period, unless we imported that all from abroad, and we'd then be back to the position where we are at the moment to some extent, where we're masking our emissions by actually offshoring quite a few of them. So this process has to be a process where we take responsibility for our own emissions in the UK and we do it properly. And the final part then of the jigsaw, I think, is that what we want to do from Labour point of view is actually cast that in terms of what has been called the Green Industrial Revolution. That is, the supply chains of all the things that we're doing are here. in the UK. So we're building turbines sourced and built in the UK. We're bringing solar manufacturing back into the UK. We're undertaking all those activities on the basis of industry, which actually is going to make a just transition between where people are now in terms of their jobs and industries to industries which actually support a low carbon economy rather than high carbon economy. So I'm sorry, Mia, I've gone on rather a long time. It is a subject I am quite interested in, so I'm afraid I've treated you, if that's quite the right word, to rather a longer exposition than I had intended to, but I hope that's useful in terms of outlining the real things we've got to do over the next period, and why the next period actually has to be more on the action, less on the rhetoric, and a determined series of real proposals which can be put into operation and maintained solidly over the next period to get us to that carbon goal, which we hope will be our contribution to actually keeping that target below 1.5 degrees.
I thank Alan very much. That's extremely detailed, but obviously quite terrifying scenario, and it really does put in perspective the huge task that faces us. So clearly, I'm sure there are people who would like to ask questions. Could I ask you two things? Firstly, to be clear and brief in your questions so we can get as many people in as possible. And secondly, if you just say your name when you start speaking, it makes it a bit easier when we're trying to answer. So if we take perhaps 2 or 3 questions to start with and then answer those and then come back. So if we start right at the back then.
Yeah, Stella Westmacott is my name. One thing I'd be interested in, you've mentioned various things about the energy, but I'm interested in the concrete making, and I mean, you haven't mentioned that at all, and I think that is a big contribution to the climate change. And what if any policies you have to reducing that?
Nina Clements, is there, I don't understand why the tidal lagoon in Swansea has been dropped. Is there any chance of that being resurrected?
Right, Bob?
One of the issues with trees is there's been some major tree diseases in this country over the years. We had the Dutch elm disease in the 70s, which wiped out the elms. We currently have ash dieback, which experts say will effectively wipe out the ash population. There's also a major disease affecting oak trees.
Yeah.
These have a significant effect on the overall tree population of the country, and there doesn't appear to be a clear policy, as far as I can see, by any major party to address this in stopping these diseases reaching the country and really treating it as a serious issue.
Yeah.
Jean Myers, how much commitment can the Labour government make towards organic farming, which doesn't use fertilisers like conventional, cows fed healthily in a different manner, emit less methane, research has shown, etc.
I can use it 2 points. It seems to me, from our point of view, cost of all this, like cost of electric cars. You know, you're in an area here of, where people haven't got so much money as actually in the southeast, and that's one thing. And how are we going to change the mindset? Because we're talking about mindset here. You're talking about big policies, but we've got to change our hearts, haven't we? How are we going to do that?
Nick Fox. Alan was talking a lot about how we're going to be quite dependent on batteries. I wonder how sustainable that's going to be, where we're going to get all the lithium on from. I assume it's lithium that's going to be based. Can that be reused when the batteries life has been spent in it being reclaimed and rejuvenated somewhere we use? Is that going to be sustainable and cause any environmental problems?
Okay, we've got 6 questions then, and we'll come back for another round.
Well, really unfortunately, you've asked me 6 spot-on questions, which among other things are things that I sort of started to cut out because of time. So I hope I'm not going to go on for another half hour answering these particular questions. Cement concrete making, that is immensely carbon rich as far as its production is concerned. There are only limited things you can do to substitute for the carbon that goes into the making and also the carbon that goes through the chemical reactions when the concrete is made. So absolutely, we are going to have we're going to have carbon capture and storage attached to any concrete cement making in this country, and we can't proceed without that in the medium to long term. Although in other energy intensive industries there are ways that you can actually substitute for carbon rich processes in their production. So steel, for example, I mean, firstly you can move to electric arc furnaces rather than blast furnaces for the production of steel. Not entirely satisfactory, but pretty good at reducing emissions quite substantially. And also you can substitute the coking element in the production with hydrogen, so that you can actually change the processes in the way that you can, for example, electrolyse ammonia in agricultural processes. So you can actually change the processes quite considerably, and I think we have to mandate those changes in process in order to get those carbon outputs down. Yes, it is true as far as trees and forestry is concerned that we are suffering quite a plague of actual and potential tree diseases. That actually, I mean, in terms of the overall tree cover, is not going to be a hugely significant part of it, but nevertheless is quite serious, and we are recognising now that a number of these diseases have actually been brought in by importation of wood products in the country in the past, and plants. I was reading recently about it's not just a question of actually making sure you've got decent controls on what is coming country in terms of imported plants, that there are quite a few occasions where beetles have come in on the back of wood products coming into the country, even though they were processed, and then they've started colonising around the country. Probably with some of those imported species, as it were, they are not easily controllable now. But clearly we need to actually, part of this tree charge that we're going to have to put in will all have to be done on the basis of native species sourced here and put in place in the UK. And by and large, those native species being reasonably proof against some of those diseases that are coming in. And also, I mean, there are some suggestions that actually there are some ashes are developing resistance to ash dieback, and so concentrating on putting those elements of species in as we bring that afforestation forward. Batteries, yes, it is true in terms of present battery production that it's dependent on rare earths, which are again subject of the largest concentration of lithium is in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. I'm not sure of the long-term process of actually digging up large parts of the Democratic Republic of the Congo is going to really cut it. Now, there is one good thing about batteries, which is that batteries don't die by and large, they fade away. So you can actually get a lot more life out of batteries, particularly car batteries, that is the case, apparently the case, by when they've done number of cycles which mean they're not particularly reliable for vehicle purposes, you then take those batteries out and put them in parallel as a large power storage source. And there are also developments in batteries which actually don't rely on lithium flow batteries and salt batteries and various other things which are coming on at the moment. I think will start to resolve some of those issues. And the final thing about batteries is that we need to be a little bit careful that as far as energy supply is concerned, I'm not talking about vehicles now, but energy supply is concerned, then actually batteries can only change the picture on a day-to-day basis, i.e. they can shave when you've got the most demand by storing it and then putting that back in the system when demand isn't there. They can't do that on a seasonal basis. You've got to do things other than batteries for that seasonal storage, and that's things like versions of Dinorvic in North Wales where you've got pumped storage, compressed air storage, various other things, so you can change that power on a seasonal basis. So batteries are not the only thing in town as far as storage is concerned. But the future tidal lagoons, Labour would want to not just restore a version, choose my words carefully, of Swansea tidal lagoon, but we would want to see a number of lagoons following from Swansea. And I don't necessarily say, as the wisdom had it previously, that you'd have Swansea tidal lagoon, then you'd have Bridgewater, then you'd have Cardiff, then you'd have Bridgewater, because all of those lagoons are in the same place, effectively, as far as tidal range is concerned. So what you want, I mean, I'm not saying you shouldn't have those in the future, but you would want to have a number of tidal lagoons in different parts of the country to take advantage of the fact that you've got a 6-7 hour tidal gap between, say, Swansea and Morecambe Bay. So if you've got tidal lagoons in various parts of the country, you've effectively got a continuous source of power coming into the grid as a whole. And depending how you do it, you can do tidal lagoons with internal chambers within the lagoon. I mean, I didn't personally think the design of the Swansea tidal lagoon as originally put forward was a terribly smart one in terms of the fact of the way the bund was done and the way that it wasn't chambered in to give you a measured flow of water out. It could be a lot more efficient than it has been designed to be, and that will be the basis on which we want to take forward tidal lagoons. And I'm absolutely convinced of the efficacy of tidal lagoons, and also in terms of one of the objections to Swansea was alleged objection, I thought it was based on false figures, was that the cost per kilowatt hour, but that again could come down very substantially in terms of larger lagoons with more efficient operating arrangements. How much is going to cost? Well, I would recommend when you go home to have a look at, it's got some profanities in it unfortunately, but there's a clip by a bloke called Bill Nye, the science guy in the United States, who's a popular scientist, a bit like Brian Cox in the United States, and there is a clip of him rather going off message, and he's got some various props and sets fire to a globe and then says, we must be stupid if we don't think it's going to cost. Of course it's going to cost, but the difference is that what's the counterfactual? What is it that it would cost us if we didn't do anything? And we can go right back to the Stern report in 2006, where the Committee on Climate Change has said that the cost of all this is probably going to be between 1 and 2% of GDP. And interestingly, that was what they said at the time of the Climate Change Act would be, excuse me, the cost of getting to 80%. And it's still 1 to 2% of GDP because of the changes in cost that's happened. Batteries down by 85%, solar panels down by about 70%, wind coming down by about 60% over the period. So as these things come in, the cost gets much lower. I mean, by probably mid-20s, it will actually be cheaper to purchase an electric vehicle than to purchase an internal combustion engine vehicle, all other things considered. And so, why wouldn't you at that particular point? So, yes, it is going to cost. It is not going to kill us in terms of the cost, but certainly if we don't do anything about it, it will. Simple as that. But if you look at all the things that happen, I've mentioned, what happens subsequently on that transition, which is why I thought the Chancellor's recent letter to the Prime Minister, which some of you may have seen, was so wrong-headed. It just talked about the cost, it didn't talk about the benefits. It didn't talk about what we're going to, over and above the fact that, when it comes to the final question, actually these changes are going to mean that we live pretty good lives, not that we're going to be pushing around handcarts and worrying about our shelter for the night. All of these things are about how to live a pretty good life, but on a low carbon basis. And you'll still come in and you'll turn the switch on and it will work perfectly well. There will be literally millions of new jobs in these new low carbon industries. And part of the process of just transition is to getting the jobs in the right places for the right people. But nevertheless, and whilst it is going to mean quite a lot of changes in people's lives, yes, but none of them, I don't think, will be changes which are going to be desperate hardships in terms of no perception at the end of those hardships that actually it is going to be better. And even if you didn't think about climate change, if you signed up to cleaner air, more access to woods and forests, transport which didn't chuck out fumes all over the place, all those things are actually net pluses to our quality of life and not net reductions. And I think we need to put that in context in terms of those changes that are ahead of us. It's going to be tough. It's going to cost quite a lot up front, but I think the benefits will be such that actually we will be able to be in a position where we're going to be able to live our lives something like they are today, but on a rather nicer basis for the future. And okay, I'll be probably long gone by the time we get to that position, but I can really see that as a long-term outcome for all of us in the end.
Sorry, organic agriculture?
Sorry, agriculture,
Yes, and then we literally have time for very short questions and short answers as we're putting time like we're speaking on.
I've talked about some of the issues relating to agriculture, but for example, one of the early things we need to get going on agriculture is to start capturing a lot of farm emissions systematically through anaerobic digestion on farms, so that you are followers of the Archers may have heard some while ago about the anaerobic digestion on plants on Bridge Farm. I think it was a bit of a bad storyline, but if you have AD plants on clusters of farms, and these already exist to some extent, then firstly you've got a systematic capture of what would otherwise be methane emitting slurries and various other farm residues. Secondly, you've got the production of biomethane from those plants, which then can go into the system in the way I've described, to a decarbonised gas system. And you've got digestate, which then goes back on the farm itself. And one of the issues in terms of present arrangements on slurries is that you've got, for example, you know, the sort of muck spreading machines which throw the stuff up in the air over the fields, and that is immensely damaging in terms of emissions. So if you're capturing that, you're then going through the process and you're putting that stuff back in the soil. At the end of the process, then you've cut out several cycles of both methane and carbon emissions in farms. Yes, I do think that we are going to have to substantially reduce the extent of dairy farming in the country overall in the long term. But as you said, there are methods of actually reducing, you know, in terms of feed and various other things, as to reducing the carbon emissions from dairy farming itself. So I mean, I would see our future food arrangements as not that everybody, you know, has to give up meat, but actually it will perform a rather different function in our diet. It won't be the meat and 2 veg, you know, on the clock, and 6 till 12 is the meat, and 1 veg is the potato, and the other veg is whatever else you call the veg. It'll be where you have that as a more a luxury on occasions, and a diet which is partly not meat, but not necessarily no meat, but with a different understanding of what it is for that dairy to take part in the process, with those arrangements that I've described for making sure that the production is actually as low carbon as it can be. I just run out of voice now as well.
I think you have. Did we have a couple of very quick questions? Bearing in mind we literally have to catch a train in about 15 minutes, so the train goes, I mean, you know, in the room.
So I've got to stand in front, I wave on the platform.
So, Christine, I think you had your hand up and on right, yeah.
Yeah, Christine Clark from Connecticut. Going back to home insulation, the government has actually encouraged people to have insulation put into their houses, and a lot of people, including my own daughter, has been ripped off.
Yeah.
It has not been suitable for the house, and it's destroyed the house. She's living with mould on the walls. She can't afford the cost of putting that right and redecorating. A firm put the beads in the wall and then went bust.
Yes.
So she had no compensation for that. How can we stop people being... People are keen to do this and do their bit, but there's an awful lot of people being ripped off.
Okay, yeah.
My name's Becky Seal, I'm from Extinction Rebellion, and I'm pleased that some of our action in April did lead to a declaration of climate emergency. And yeah, I do feel in listening to you, it's almost like we've set our houses on fire, but we're going to put the fire out next week. Is the Labour Party willing to actually tell the truth about the catastrophe that we're facing, and that actually what we need is a radical system change in order to combat climate change? Thank you.
Can I just take those? Okay. Oh, thank you very much. That's great. It is true that in a number of renewable and low carbon technologies there's been quite a lot of ripping off going on. So solar panel installation has been subject to that to some extent. I mean, I've got in addition to, I've got a solar roof at home, and I've also got solar water collection. And when I came to get my solar water collection up rated, the company had indeed gone bust and put my solar water in the first place. I mean, it was resolved okay, but I appreciate there's that problem. So there has been, yes, a problem of cowboys in insulation, and frankly, if we're going ahead with this sort of scheme that we want to, then that's got to be guaranteed by public authorities rather than a whole load of private contractors coming in. Private contractors may work in it, but actually the whole guarantee in the background process, particularly, for example, it's not just a question of putting cavity wall insulation in, say for the 8 million homes I've mentioned, with no cavity walls at all, that will be putting external cladding on properties, and that's got to work, and it's got to be guaranteed in the long term, and it's got to be publicly underwritten. And so, yes, we need public standards on that, and I think that's said. Becky, I think what I've said this afternoon, pretty much, number one, okay, you're shaking your head, pretty much addresses number one, yes, we have a climate emergency, yes, the world is on fire, yes, we need to put it out as soon as we can, and what I've concentrated on this afternoon is not the weather on all of those, but the how. And I think that's as I said, the really important thing right now is that actually it's not going to be much good if you know, people say, well, in Parliament we signed up to net zero, and then we either leave it to the market or we leave it to well-intentioned individuals to do the business. I think we've absolutely got to get, you know, literally an adding up of the numbers and the demonstration that the numbers can be reached by these particular ways of doing it. And I don't think there's any alternative to that in terms of guaranteeing we can actually get there. And that's what my biggest fear is. Actually, we will put things in place which sound good at the beginning, and actually no one follows them through, no one makes them work properly. And that's why I think we've actually got to have a very substantial amount of state involvement in this, quite honestly, in terms of actually A, funding, B, regulating, and B, and C, literally overseeing what is happening so we can guarantee we're going to get there. But I don't think, and I've talked to large numbers of people on, you know, Extinction Rebellion, school strikers, etc. And I really don't think there is much between us in terms of what, you know, understanding of where we are, what we've got to do, how we've got to do it, the time we've got to do it within. There will be arguments about whether things are sufficient, whether things are misconceived, but I'd much rather have those arguments than arguments about the fundamentals of it. And of course we're going to fall out on the idea that, you know, maybe you know, what is being said about electric vehicles has got, you know, problems on the side. You need to get those sorted out as you go along. But the idea that we're just going to have to do these things to the extent and at the speed that I've described, I don't think is any more in dispute. And so it's a dispute about, or it will be dispute about means and not ends in the future. And that's what I hope the debate will proceed on the basis from now on. But I'm sure you got, well, I would hope you would have things which actually will be disputes on precisely those issues. So we need to have a constant dialogue on whether the stuff that we're saying over the next period really does work as well as we think it is, and that seems to me the role for the debate in the future. And indeed, whether, you know, like whether my suggestion on trees is just going to end up with a load of dead saplings rather than, you know, the forests for the future, that sort of thing.
Citizens' Assembly, please.
Sorry?
Citizens' Assembly.
Yeah, well, interestingly, a number of the select committees in Parliament have actually going to set up citizens' assemblies in the not too distant future to discuss precisely these points. And that is exactly what I think citizens' assemblies can actually really get to the heart of. And I'm absolutely with that. But what I would say though is that I do think getting the structures in place where all this can happen is actually something we've just got to get done in Parliament, and no messing about, just do it. And then we are able to discuss between ourselves all those sort of things about how you do it best and what the what the arrangements are, but you know, it is just not negotiable anymore to say, well, we can take it a bit easier, or we can do it in fundamentally different ways where the figures don't add up in the end. That's just got to be done as part of the climate emergency we're in, and then we talk in different ways thereafter.
Right, but I think we're going to absolutely have to finish that. Obviously, if there are more questions, then you're always very welcome to email me, and I can pass them on to Alan. If you obviously want to stay and chat yourself, I'm going to whiz Alan down to stand on the platform now, ready for the train. And as I say, do feel free to chat and what have you.
Thanks very much for inviting me this afternoon. I've learned a lot, so it's great.